Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to crack open the fascinating science behind a frustration pretty much every language learner knows all too well. Today, we're zooming in on exactly why struggling to speak a new language, stumbling over your words, completely blanking on vocabulary, just hitting that mental wall, why that is actually the hidden key to fluency. I want you to think about your own language journey for a second. Why is it that you can sit back, comfortably listen to a Spanish podcast, or maybe read a French news article and understand, honestly, almost everything? But the literal second someone asks you a question, your mind goes completely, totally blank. It is incredibly frustrating, right? We've all been there. Well, today we're unpacking the research to explain exactly why this happens and why that very frustration is something you actually need to start actively seeking out.
All right, Section 1, the comprehension trap.
So to understand how to really achieve fluency, we first got to look at this massive theory that accidentally led entire generations of learners straight into a trap. Back in 1977, researcher Stephen Krashen introduced what he called the input hypothesis. He basically argued that if you're just exposed to enough comprehensible input, meaning hearing and reading language you mostly understand, you'll just subconsciously acquire it. The implication here? It implied you could basically soak up a language like a sponge without ever having to actually speak a word of it. But sadly, no, sleeping with a Spanish textbook under your pillow is absolutely not going to make you fluent.
This right here brilliantly illustrates a huge divide that eventually emerged in the research. Early second language acquisition relied super heavily on Krashen's idea of just getting simple input. But soon after, researchers like Michael Long started noticing something big was missing. Long brought us the interaction hypothesis. He pointed out that when we negotiate communication problems, like simply asking someone to repeat themselves, we modify our interactions. And that is what actually helps make the input comprehensible. So just passively listening, that wasn't the whole story. Moving on to Section 2, the immersion anomaly. Around this same time, this wild, real-world academic mystery popped up. It was the 1970s, and an applied linguist named Merrill Swain was observing these French immersion schools up in Canada. Now, these kids were being taught their regular everyday school subjects entirely in French. So according to the input hypothesis, this massive daily exposure to comprehensible input should have made them perfectly fluent, right? But Swain noticed a huge anomaly. The students rarely spoke anything longer than a single clause, and even worse, even after years of this heavy immersion, their grammatical errors just persisted. They had hit a really hard plateau.
As Swain and her co-author Henri Barrick so clearly stated in their 1974 paper, some of the errors do not disappear. So what does this all mean? Well, Swain realized these students were incredibly smart. They were just deducing the meaning of their French lessons purely from context, without ever actually learning the underlying grammar. They proved once and for all that input alone was entirely insufficient for true fluency.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, the output hypothesis.
To solve this Canadian mystery, Merrill Swain proposed the output hypothesis. Basically, if input wasn't enough, what was? The answer is production. While Krashen was out there saying input is literally all you need, Swain fired back, arguing that production is actually required to learn. She pushed for meaningful communication and grammatical accuracy right from the very start. Her whole point was that actively producing output forces you to stop just guessing at the meaning and makes you actually process the language syntactically. And Swain actually broke down exactly why output works into three really distinct functions. First up, the noticing or triggering function. This is when you try to say something and bam, you realize you just don't have the words. Second is the hypothesis testing function. This is where you try out a grammatical structure just to see if the other person actually understands you. And third, the metalinguistic function, which is using language to actively reflect on the language you just produced. This three-step process, it's literally the engine of fluency.
Okay, Section 4, noticing the gap. Let's zoom in a bit on that first step of Swain's model, a concept known as noticing the gap. Output literally forces you to hit a mental wall. When you try to speak, you suddenly create this very conscious awareness of what you want to say versus the super limited forms you can actually produce. And you know what? That exact moment of hesitation, that frustrating mismatch, that is the exact moment your brain is primed to learn.
This whole metaphor of the gap connects directly to the work of researcher Richard Schmidt. In his 1990 noticing hypothesis, Schmidt firmly put his foot down and stated that subliminal language learning is simply impossible. You absolutely cannot learn a language by playing tapes while you sleep. Conscious noticing, that acute awareness triggered by your struggle to output, is the absolute non-negotiable prerequisite for converting raw input into actual learned intake.
Now, if you look at how things evolved over the years, the academic consensus completely shifted. We started with Krashen's monitor model over there on the left, which claimed fluency was largely unconscious. But moving through Van Patten's input processing to Smith's noticing hypothesis, and finally landing on Ellis's creed theory, the role of consciousness becomes completely central. The science ultimately proved a really powerful maxim: those who notice most, learn most. And honestly, absolutely nothing makes you notice your own gaps better than trying to speak.
Finally, Section 5, putting output into practice. Let's make this actionable. So how do we actually turn all this cognitive research into real results? Well, the science points us straight toward task-based language teaching. An exercise is basically just filling in the blanks in a textbook, right? You're just displaying the correct use of a predetermined form. But a task? A task is real-world text creation. It is decoding and encoding messages to achieve a genuine outcome. Real tasks force you to negotiate meaning, which stretches your linguistic resources infinitely more than those repetitive textbook drills ever could.
So what should you actually do today? Well, here are some actionable strategies pulled straight from the research of experts like Dowdy, Pica, and Swain. First, engage in two-way group tasks where you actively have to exchange information. Second, keep a language diary. The literature actually shows this serves a vital cathartic function to help you process the frustrations of output. Also, when you're stuck, force yourself to negotiate. Just saying something simple like pardon makes the speaker modify their input, which naturally triggers your whole noticing and integration process.
Which brings us to our final takeaway. Look, the illusion of input is comfortable, sure, but it is a total trap. Fluency lives in the struggle. Every single time you stumble over a sentence, every time you desperately search for a word, your brain is actively noticing the gap and literally rewiring itself for fluency. So please, don't hide from the discomfort of speaking. Embrace it. Ask yourself right now, what will you struggle to say today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep learning.